They had been told the Americans were weak, that the United States was a nation of factories, not fighters, a country that relied on noise, numbers, and movies, not discipline, not endurance, not real warfare. For years, German soldiers marched across Europe, believing they belonged to the most powerful military machine ever built, convinced that no force on earth could truly stop them. They believed history itself was on their side. And then, in 1945, they watched that belief collapse in silence. What the German army faced in the final months of the war was not chaos, it was not panic, it was not the disorganized force they had been warned about by propaganda. What advanced toward them from the West was something far more terrifying. A disciplined, methodical, and overwhelmingly prepared American war machine, forged by industry, strategy, and an unshakable sense of purpose. For many German soldiers, the shock was not defeat itself, the shock was who defeated them. By the time American forces pushed deep into Europe, the illusion of German invincibility was already cracking. Cities lay in ruins, supply lines were shattered, and the once feared Wehrmacht was exhausted beyond repair. Yet even then, many German troops believed one final myth, that surrendering to the Americans would mean facing a brutal, vengeful enemy, an army that would treat prisoners with cruelty, fueled by hatred and revenge. What they encountered instead challenged everything they thought they knew about the United States. Across the battlefields of Europe, German units began laying down their weapons, often stunned by what stood before them. Endless columns of American soldiers, tanks that never seemed to run out of, trucks packed with food, fuel, and ammunition, and an organization so precise it felt unstoppable. The Americans did not arrive screaming triumph. They arrived calmly, efficiently, as if victory had already been decided long before the last shots were fired. For German prisoners of war, this was the moment the war truly ended, not with an explosion, but with realization. Behind this unstoppable advance stood something the German leadership had underestimated from the very beginning: the full industrial and strategic power of the United States. While Nazi Germany conquered through speed and fear, America conquered through preparation and endurance. Factories thousands of miles away worked day and night, producing weapons faster than the enemy could destroy them. Soldiers crossed an ocean, fought on foreign soil, and advanced relentlessly, not for conquest, but to end a war that had plunged the world into darkness. As American troops closed in from the west and Soviet forces crushed Berlin from the east, the German high command faced the inevitable. Hitler was dead. The chain of command was broken. Entire armies were surrendering, not because they were surrounded, but because they finally understood the truth. This was a war they could no longer win. And among all their enemies, it was the Americans who symbolized that realization most clearly: calm, confident, and completely in control. In early May of 1945, German representatives sought a way out. Not a victory, not even a negotiated peace, just an end. The men who once believed they ruled the future of Europe now searched for a table, a pen, and permission to stop fighting. And when that moment came, when Germany finally agreed to surrender unconditionally, it was more than a military defeat. It was the collapse of a worldview. The moment an empire built on arrogance was forced to face the strength it had mocked. For the United States, this was not just the end of a campaign. It was the proof that American power, when fully awakened, could cross oceans, dismantle tyrannies, and reshape history itself. The German soldiers who stood as prisoners in 1945 were not just witnessing the end of a war, they were witnessing the rise of a new global reality, one in which the United States had proven, beyond any doubt, that it was not only capable of fighting the world's greatest war, but of winning it. And this was only the beginning.
By the spring of 1945, the German war effort was no longer collapsing slowly. It was unraveling all at once. Entire divisions were disappearing from the map, not because they were destroyed in battle, but because they no longer had the strength, the supplies, or the belief to continue fighting. From Normandy to the Rhine, American forces advanced with a confidence that left no room for doubt. Every mile gained sent a clear message to the German command. Resistance was no longer changing the outcome, only delaying the inevitable. Inside Germany, the reality was even more brutal. Communications were failing, orders contradicted one another, and millions of civilians fled westward, desperately hoping to surrender to American troops instead of Soviet forces advancing from the east. This alone revealed a powerful truth. Even after years of propaganda portraying the United States as inferior, German soldiers and civilians alike trusted American forces more than any other enemy. They believed the Americans represented order, law, and restraint, a stark contrast to the fear and uncertainty surrounding the final days of the Third Reich. After Hitler's death, what remained of the German leadership faced a decision they had once considered unthinkable. Admiral Karl Dönitz, now acting head of state, knew the war was lost. But instead of continuing a meaningless fight, his priority became clear: stop the bloodshed, preserve what remained of the nation, and surrender, preferably to the Americans and their Western allies. This was not an act of strategy, it was an admission of reality. Germany no longer dictated terms, it could only ask for permission to end the war. That moment arrived in May 7, 1945, in the quiet city of Reims, France. Far from the front lines, inside an unremarkable building used as Allied headquarters, history reached its breaking point. German General Alfred Jodl entered the room not as a negotiator, but as a messenger of defeat. There were no demands, no conditions, no speeches. The document placed on the table offered only one option: unconditional surrender. Everything the German military had fought for over 6 years would end with a single signature. The presence of American officers in that room carried enormous weight. The United States was no longer the distant power across the Atlantic. It was now the central pillar of the Allied victory in Western Europe. When Jodl signed the surrender, he did not just accept defeat at the hands of a coalition. He accepted that American military power had reached the heart of Europe and could no longer be denied, underestimated, or dismissed as temporary. At 2:41 a.m., the document was signed. The German High Command officially acknowledged total defeat. The war in Europe would end within hours. For the men who had once believed Germany ruled the future, the moment was almost surreal. There were no cheers from the defeated side, no anger, only silence, disbelief, and the crushing realization that the world they were told would last 1,000 years had collapsed in less than a decade. For American forces across Europe, the significance of that signature was profound. It validated every sacrifice, every landing on hostile beaches, every frozen night, every fallen soldier. The United States had not entered the war to conquer territory or claim empires. It had entered to end a global threat, and now that threat had formally surrendered in the presence of American leadership. Yet even as the ink dried on the document in Reims, the story was not entirely finished. The surrender, though real and binding, would not be the final chapter. Politics, power, and the realities of alliance meant that one more moment was still to come, a final act that would seal the end of Nazi Germany forever. And that act would take place not in France, but in the ruined capital of the Reich itself. Germany admitted defeat, but the world was about to watch it one last time, in full view of history.
Even after Germany signed its surrender in Reims, the war had not yet fully ended in the eyes of the world. For the Allied leaders, especially the Soviet Union, the collapse of Nazi Germany demanded a final, unmistakable moment, one that would leave no room for interpretation, denial, or historical distortion. The Reich had begun its war of conquest from Berlin, and Berlin itself now lay in ruins. If the Third Reich was to die completely, it would do so in its own capital, surrounded by the armies that had destroyed it. As May turned into its final days, representatives of the defeated German military were ordered to travel east into a city that no longer resembled the seat of a world power. Berlin in 1945 was a graveyard of ambition. Streets were crushed under rubble, buildings stood hollow and burned, and the symbols of Nazi dominance had been reduced to ash. For German officers arriving to sign the final surrender, the message was unmistakable. This was not a negotiation. This was an ending. On the night of May 8, 1945, inside a former German military engineering school in the district of Karlshorst, the last act of the European war was prepared. Allied representatives gathered in a room heavy with silence and significance. Flags of the victorious powers stood behind the table, a visual reminder that Germany now stood alone, stripped of authority, stripped of illusions. Among those present were Soviet commanders, British and French representatives, and American officers who stood as witnesses to the final collapse of the regime that had once dared to challenge them. When the German delegation entered the room, there was no defiance left, no pride, no belief in destiny. These men were not the confident officers of 1939. They were the remains of a shattered command structure, carrying the weight of total defeat. They understood that this document would erase the last trace of Nazi Germany as a fighting force. Once signed, there would be no armies left to command, no fronts to defend, no future to delay. As the surrender document was read aloud, every word reinforced a single truth. Germany accepted complete and unconditional defeat. All German forces everywhere would cease combat operations. There would be no exceptions, no temporary pauses, no strategic retreats disguised as negotiations. The war was over because the Allies, led in the West by American power, had made its continuation impossible. When the German representatives finally signed the document, the time was just after midnight. In Central Europe, it was already May 9th. In the United States and Western Europe, it was still May 8th. This small difference in hours would later divide calendars and commemorations, but the reality remained unchanged. At that precise moment, Nazi Germany ceased to exist as a military force. The empire that had promised domination had been dismantled completely. For American leaders and soldiers, this final ceremony carried deep meaning. It confirmed what had already been proven on the battlefield. The United States had crossed an ocean, fought through unfamiliar land, and stood firm against one of the most aggressive regimes in human history. American strategy, logistics, leadership, and sacrifice had helped bring the war to an end, not through destruction alone, but through overwhelming control of the battlefield.
While the Soviet Union bore the weight of brutal combat in the East, it was American power that stabilized and dominated the Western Front, pushing relentlessly towards Germany's heart. The surrender in Berlin was not just a Soviet moment, or a British moment, or a French moment. It was the culmination of a coalition held together by American strength, military, industrial, and moral. As the ceremony ended, there were no celebrations in the room, no applause, no speeches. History had already spoken. Outside, Berlin remained silent under the weight of its own destruction. Inside, the war that had consumed Europe for 6 long years was finally finished, and the German officers who left that room did so knowing they had witnessed the end of everything they had once believed was permanent. The guns would soon fall silent across the continent, but the impact of what had just happened would echo far beyond Europe and far beyond 1945.
When the news of Germany's final surrender spread across the world, it moved faster than any army ever could. Radios crackled with announcements, church bells rang in cities that had lived under blackout for years, and across the United States, millions of people realized that a war once thought distant had been won by their sons, brothers, and fathers fighting on foreign soil. Victory in Europe was no longer a possibility, it was a fact. And for Americans at home, it was the moment when sacrifice transformed into history. In cities across the United States, streets filled almost instantly. Flags appeared in windows, strangers embraced, and silence gave way to celebration. But this was not just joy, it was relief. The relief of knowing that American power, when finally unleashed, had done exactly what it promised to do. It had crossed the Atlantic, stood firm against tyranny, and forced one of the most dangerous regimes in human history to surrender without conditions. The war in Europe had ended not with compromise, but with total victory. While celebrations erupted in the West, a very different scene unfolded among German soldiers who had surrendered. Many of them stood in American custody, watching the world change around them. These men had been raised on the belief that Germany would dominate the century, that its enemies would eventually collapse under pressure. Instead, they found themselves guarded by calm, disciplined American troops who treated them with order, structure, and restraint. For many prisoners, this quiet professionalism was more unsettling than any act of aggression could have been. German prisoners of war quickly realized that the myths they had believed were false. They saw the scale of American logistics, the endless flow of supplies, the confidence of soldiers who knew the war was already decided. They were fed, they were registered, they were processed not as symbols of hatred, but as defeated soldiers in a system that had already moved beyond revenge. This experience shattered years of propaganda in a matter of days. The United States was not the reckless, undisciplined enemy they had been taught to fear. It was an organized force that had mastered modern warfare. Across Europe, American soldiers began the difficult transition from combat to occupation. They entered cities that had been shaped by fear and destruction, bringing with them stability and control. Their presence marked a turning point. For civilians, American uniforms no longer meant bombs falling from the sky, but the return of order, food, and a future. For the defeated, it meant the end of illusion. The war was lost not because of fate or betrayal, it was lost because American power had outmatched the German war machine at every critical level. In Germany itself, the realization was unavoidable. The surrender documents were not just papers signed in distant rooms. They were reflected in empty streets, dismantled commands, and soldiers returning home without banners or victory. The empire that promised dominance left behind only ruins and questions, and standing among those ruins was the undeniable presence of the United States, not as a conqueror seeking land, but as a force that had ended a nightmare. For Americans, this victory carried a deeper meaning. It confirmed that the nation's strength did not lie only in weapons, but in unity, production, and resolve. Factories that once built cars had built tanks. Farmers had fed armies overseas. Families had endured years of uncertainty. And in the end, that collective effort forced Nazi Germany to accept a truth it could no longer deny. The United States had become the decisive power in the Western world. As Europe began to breathe again, one question remained unspoken but deeply felt. If American strength could dismantle a regime that once terrified an entire continent, what role would the United States now play in shaping the future of the world? The war was over, but the impact of America's victory was only beginning to reveal itself. When the last surrendered documents were signed and the guns finally fell silent across Europe, the end of the war revealed something far greater than victory alone. It revealed a shift in history itself. Nazi Germany had not simply been defeated on the battlefield. It had been dismantled by a level of power it could never match. A power that crossed oceans, endured unimaginable losses, and emerged stronger, more organized, and more determined than anyone had believed possible. That power was the United States of America. For German soldiers who had once marched beneath banners of superiority, the aftermath was sobering. The world they were taught would last 1,000 years vanished in less than a decade. What remained were ruins, unanswered questions, and the undeniable reality that American strength had reshaped the fate of Europe. The United States had not sought empire. It had not fought for conquest, yet when the war ended, it stood at the center of the New World Order, not by accident, but by resolve. American soldiers began returning home, carrying memories of places they had never known before the war, and sacrifices that could never be fully repaid. They returned not as conquerors, but as veterans of a war that had demanded everything from them. At home, families welcomed them as heroes, not because they sought glory, but because they had done what history required. They had answered a call that reached across an ocean and changed the course of civilization. In Europe, the American presence remained, not as an occupying force driven by fear, but as a stabilizing power. Roads were rebuilt, cities began to rise from rubble, former enemies became partners in reconstruction. The same nation that had unleashed its industrial might to destroy a war machine now used that strength to help rebuild what had been broken. This dual legacy, overwhelming force in war, steady leadership in peace, became the defining mark of American power in the modern world. For Germany, the surrender marked the end of illusion and the beginning of reckoning. The belief in dominance, in destiny, in invincibility had collapsed under the weight of reality. And standing on the other side of that collapse was a nation that had once been mocked, underestimated, and dismissed. The United States had proven that strength does not need arrogance to be absolute. It needs preparation, unity, and the will to act when the moment demands it. The surrender of Nazi Germany was not just the conclusion of the Second World War in Europe. It was the moment the United States stepped fully onto the world stage as a global leader, a nation capable of confronting tyranny, sustaining sacrifice, and shaping the future long after the fighting ends. The German soldiers who laid down their weapons in 1945 were not only witnessing defeat, they were witnessing the rise of a power that would define the rest of the century.
History remembers that moment not for the silence that followed the final signature, but for what it made possible. A Europe no longer ruled by fear, a world that understood the cost of unchecked ambition, and a United States that had proven beyond any doubt that strength does not need arrogance to be absolute. It needs preparation, unity, and the will to act when the moment demands it. The war was over, the world was transformed, and the lesson was clear. Some powers rise not to dominate history, but to stop it from being destroyed.